Why hello there, and welcome back to Let's Make Us a Character. And my continuing trek through the tunnels of the actual first role-playing game, Tunnels and Trolls. Fight me, D&D simps. And in this video, we will be Let's Making Us a Character for Tunnels and Trolls 7th edition. Well, 7.5, which is basically the same. And if you have been following this series, you might be noticing that the last video was on 5th edition, and wondering what happened to 6th, as 6 does often come between 5 and 7. Well, now I get to actually explain the weird-ass version history of this game. Now, you may remember from my first Tunnels and Trolls video that I said this game had somewhere between like 5 and 13 editions. And honestly, that was a fairly conservative estimate. So let's just get it all out of the way. The first edition of Tunnels and Trolls was released in 1975, with 2nd and 3rd following not too long after, and those were the 3 side-stapled typewritten editions and were only very minor revisions. As was the 4th edition from 1977, but at the very least that one changed from the side staples to a comb-bound format. And for some reason also had a landscape format cover, but the interior was mostly the same as the previous 3 editions, and was then followed in 1979 by 5th edition, which made the big step up to a perfect bound softcover and actual layout design instead of just being, as I said, written out on a typewriter. Then, as I mentioned in the last video, after that, the game was just kind of left to sit there for a few decades. Which is why, in 2001, Outlaw Press released an unauthorized 6th edition, which my research says was available in print, but I have just been unable to find any photographic evidence of. Like, I got really close, but the internet is full of dead links. Then, as mentioned, 5.5 was released in 2005, for some reason, the same year as the Tunnels and Trolls 30th Anniversary Edition, which is specifically stated in the book to be 7th edition, and actually does address 6th, stating, "You may wonder what happened to the missing 6th edition of Tunnels and Trolls. I'm afraid it shall remain ever mythical. It came and went in various pirated and unprinted editions that had no sanction from me or Flying Buffalo. I saw some of them, and the mythical 6th had some updates and rule changes that made a lot of sense. In the most charitable sense of the word, I consider these unauthorized versions of the TNT rules to be simply those people's house rules, and you all have a right to house rules." So the unauthorized 6th edition is kind of also the official 6th edition, and don't worry, it gets even weirder. Like, I have also found a cover for another 6th edition, which is credited to Blade, but no evidence of said 6th edition existing in any format beyond that cover, so perhaps one of those unprinted editions. And then, speaking of the mythical 6th, Outlaw Press then re-released their mythical 6th edition in 2008. I have read. Getting exact dates on bootlegs can be a little difficult if they do not provide one. I mean, it's not like there's a copyright notice. But it is stated as being written by and for the GMs and players of the 5th edition that, for whatever reason, have not yet taken the journey to the 7th edition. So, definitely post-7th, and I assume also pre-7.5, which was also from 2008, and is the edition that this video is about. But moving on, we then have Tunnels and Trolls 8th edition, released by Grimtooth in 2012, which is officially licensed, but also French. And from what I have read in English, is a revision of 7th edition that adds back in some of the rules from 5th edition that may or may not have been intentionally left out of 7th. And then finally, Deluxe Tunnels and Trolls in 2015. And then after that, Flying Buffalo and all owned products were purchased by Webbed Sphere in 2021, who did not do anything with the Tunnels and Trolls brand other than canceling existing third-party licensing deals. Then in 2023, Flying Buffalo's role-playing game assets were acquired by Rebellion Unplugged, which is the tabletop game division of Rebellion Developments, who you are of course most likely familiar with as the developers of Alien vs. Predator for the Atari Jaguar. And Sniper Elite, I guess, but I feel like Alien vs. Predator for the Atari Jaguar is the much more notable product. And a new edition for 2025 has been teased and does seem to actually be moving along, but if every new edition that was teased actually came out, I would have reviewed Slasher Flick 2 back in 2023. And of course, I did not. Little salty about that one. And I know what you're thinking, that's only 12 editions, barely even worth noting. Well, let's also consider Monsters Monsters, which is basically Tunnels and Trolls, but you play as the monsters, of which there are 2 or 3 editions, and also all of the other international releases, which may or may not have new and or altered rules, most notably though, Hyper Tunnels and Trolls from Japan, which definitely did add several new mechanics, as well as 6 new classes, which the English language versions never really got the hang of. So if we wanted to pad out that number, we could say that there are at least 16 editions of Tunnels and Trolls. And if we wanted to be extremely conservative with it, we could say that 1st through 4th can be considered one edition, as can 5th and 5.5, and 7th and 7.5, and of course Deluxe. And then we can just ignore the unauthorized editions as well as Monsters Monsters, which, I mean, technically is not Tunnels and Trolls, and all of the non-English language versions because ignoring any information that is not in English is a core part of internet academia. And, you know, regular academia. Take that, academia! Leaving us with 4 editions of Tunnels and Trolls, let's just call them Original, Classic, Anniversary, and Deluxe. And that 4 edition structure is basically what I am going with for these videos. I did 1 on 1st and 4th, 1 on 5th, ignoring 5.5 because it is not available. Will of course be skipping the unauthorized 6th edition, am currently doing a video on 7.5, you are watching it right now. Then we'll also be skipping 8th, just because I don't speak French, like, at all. And then on to Deluxe, and if some 50th anniversary edition materializes, maybe I'll cover that too. But I don't have high hopes on that. As for the outliers, Monsters Monsters is a definite possibility for the future, and it's not likely, but also not impossible that I will cover Hyper Tunnels and Trolls at some point, because it is actually surprisingly affordable for an obscure Japanese exclusive edition of Tunnels and Trolls, and obviously I am interested enough in it to have looked into how difficult it would be to get. But for now, back to 7th edition. Both versions of which were released in PDF and box set format from Fiery Dragon Productions, under license from Flying Buffalo, but of course is still credited entirely to Ken St. Andre, which unfortunately does mean large blocks of text copied over directly from previous editions, as was his primary writing style. And the box sets are actually kinda interesting. The 30th Anniversary Edition came in a metal tin with wire-bound rulebook, saddle-stapled Monsters and Magic book, and 32-page book of alternative rules, which is actually just an entire different version of the game. Then of course some dice and a CD that the box says contains printable character sheets and adventure PDFs, and according to the book contains an expanded equipment PDF and combat example PDF, but I do not have that CD, so the exact contents are a bit of a mystery. And finally, some battle mats and cardstock tokens, which Tunnels and Trolls is, you know, kinda notable for not using. Weird. Then we have 7.5 in a more traditional cardstock box, which is also notably the first edition since first edition to not feature Liz Danforth art on the cover or in the book, and contains a spiral-bound rulebook, the same Monsters and Magic book, but not the alternative rules because their swag was too different, as well as dice, tokens, and a printed character sheet. Plus a full-color map, solo and GM adventures, and 2 new spiral-bound books, the Monstrum Codex Monster Book and Codex Incantatum Spellbook. And are you ready for this to get absolutely goddamn insane? Those 2 books, as well as the adventures, were produced by Outlaw Press, who you may know from me having just mentioned that they produced the unauthorized 6th edition of Tunnels and Trolls, but also they produced lots of other unauthorized Tunnels and Trolls content, including Gamma Troll World, which I actually kinda want to check out, but cannot find, as well as unauthorized reprints of official Tunnels and Trolls books. Like, they were very unambiguously a bootleg publisher who somehow, between the release of 7th edition and 7.5, managed to get themselves authorization to publish Tunnels and Trolls content, and even managed to get some of that content into the 7.5 box set, and receive special thanks in the dedication of the 7.5 rulebook. Like, the adventures are literally written by Ken St. Andre and say, originally published by Outlaw Press, so he was not just authorizing, but directly working with them at this point, which, as I said, is completely insane. Although according to my research, by 2010 Ken St. Andre had very publicly terminated relations with Outlaw Press, probably because they were a bootleg publisher who had been making and selling unauthorized Tunnels and Trolls content for years, and also stole all the art from their books, which is very well documented, and even got caught selling reprints of older editions, claiming them to be originals. You know, stuff that any normal person would see as a massive red flag against working with someone. And one last thing before I get into the whole let's make us a character part of this let's make us a character video, you might want to know what the difference is between 7 and 7.5. Well, aside from the differences mentioned in box contents, 7.5 adds an expanded equipment section and lengthy set of combat examples, which are probably the PDFs from the CD, as well as a chronology of Troll World, which could also have been on the CD. As mentioned, I don't have the CD. But in terms of actual rules changes, calling them minor could possibly overstate their significance, so I will just mention those when they come up. And now, let's make us a Tunnels and Trolls 7th edition character. 7th edition brings an exciting new radical concept to the gaming table, a pre-made character sheet. That's right, no more writing your character on an index card or scrap of paper. The future of the 1980s is now. And characters now have 8 attributes: strength, constitution, dexterity, speed, intelligence, wizardry, luck, and charisma. So same as before, but now with the addition of speed and wizardry. And if you're wondering if wizardry is there to replace the comically high required strength for magic users, yes it is. And we roll 3d6 for each, but now may choose where to put them or just go straight through from beginning to end. However, since we rolled triplets on one roll, we invoke the triples add and roll over rule, or TARO, meaning that we get to roll again and add the results to the total. And notably, it is stated that this rule always applies in TNT, so presumably, any time that 3 or more dice are rolled, this becomes a possibility. And I'm sure you're thinking, well, obviously, very important, TARO, triples add and roll over. This rule always applies in TNT. That's just like a little side note to remind you of a rule that is explained fully somewhere else in the book, and not just like the entirety of this very important rule's explanation. And, oh sweetie, welcome to Tunnels and Trolls. That is actually remarkable clarity in rules explanation. So let's choose to put those there, and those are our attributes. And there is also an advanced character creation method, which is just a point-buy system that amounts to just give the player some points, and also negates other important aspects of character creation like kin modifiers and, of course, Taro. So, worth mentioning but not exploring. And speaking of kin modifiers, next we need to choose a kin type. And we have more or less the same options as previous editions: human, dwarf, elf, fairy, hob instead of hobbit because you were significantly less likely to get away with hobbit in 2005, and leprechaun. And leprechauns are still restricted to only being wizards, but unlike 5th edition, they've lost the additional restrictions, so can actually be full wizards instead of weird secondary wizards, but are still the only kin type with any kind of class restriction, which is still weird. And speaking of the viability of certain species being magic users, since wizardry now replaces strength as your mana pool, kin that take a penalty to strength are actually viable spellcasters, including leprechauns. But I am not going to make a leprechaun because another change to the rules that I will get to later has actually made fairies a more viable option. So let's pull up the common Kindred attribute modifiers table, and notably the modifiers have been changed from fractions to decimals, which, yeah, is easier for your calculator, but much less intuitive to do without one. Also, dwarves finally got a meaningful penalty to slightly balance out their objectively overpowered modifiers of double strength and constitution, now taking a 1/3 cut to luck, versus 5th edition where they took a 1/3 cut to charisma, and previous editions where they had no penalties, only 2 times strength and constitution. So let's apply our fairy modifiers of 1/4 strength and con, double dexterity, luck, charisma, and wizardry, and no adjustment to intelligence or speed. Then let's pull up the height and weight table and roll for 6'1" and 170 pounds. Then back to the Kindred modifiers table, and things are somehow even worse this time. The proportional weight of dwarves and hobbits has doubled. Actually, more than doubled for dwarfs. A dwarf now weighs twice as much as humans at 2/3 height, and hobs weigh the same as humans despite being half as tall. Also, for some reason, leprechauns have gone from 1/3 height and 1/4 weight to 1/4 height and 1/3 weight. And you might assume that they somehow got the relationship between height and weight backwards, believing that weight scaled slower than height, not faster. But then, they also somehow got the fairy height and weight mathematically correct. 1/10 height equals 1/1000th weight. 0.1 cubed is 0.001, versus 1/10 height and 1/200th weight in 5th edition. So there must have been some intention behind these numbers, but I have no idea what that is. And maybe you're thinking that perhaps there is a reason, which is explained in the descriptions of the various kindreds. And obviously the fact that I am phrasing it like this means that there isn't any. And I don't mean there isn't any explanation, I mean there isn't any descriptions of the kindred types. Point is, adjusted height of 7.3 inches and 0.17 pounds. And now that we have our final attributes, we can calculate our adds, which are added to rolls in combat, and are equal to +1 for each point of strength, dexterity, luck, and now speed above 12, and -1 for each point below 9. So -7 strength, +6 dexterity, +0 speed, and +12 luck for +11 overall. Those 2 times modifiers can really add up. Then we need to calculate our weight possible, which is the number of weight units we can carry, a weight unit being equal to 1/10 pound. So we weigh 1.7 weight units, about the same as 4 arrows. And our weight possible is equal to our strength times 100, so we can carry 200 weight units, a bit over 100 times our body weight. We also start speaking the common tongue and gain 1 additional language for each 1 our intelligence is over 12, and there is no language table in this edition, but I still have access to the one from 5th edition, so 12 additional languages. And now for the character types. As usual, we have warriors who are incapable of using magic, double the bonuses from all armor, and new in this edition, add their level to damage. Wizards, who can cast all magics, start with all level 1 spells, but then have to buy additional ones from the Wizards Guild, can reduce the cost of casting spells by their level when using a magical focus, reduce the cost of casting lower level spells by the difference between caster and spell level, and at 5th level can even create their own unique spells, but cannot use any weapons that deal more than 2 dice damage. And Rogue, who can use all magics and weapons, but get none of the other benefits of warriors or wizards, and only start with 1 level 1 spell, and can only learn more by being taught by a player wizard or purchasing them on the black market. And new in this edition, rogues also get a special roguery talent, which I will explain later when I explain talents. And then in this edition, we also have 3 exciting new character types. Or 5, or 1, numbers are weird. So first, Specialist, who is a character, possibly a mutant or savant of some kind, who was born with an ability bordering on, or fully within the realm of, the supernatural. And there are 3 kinds of specialists, each with specific prerequisites. Specialist Mage, a specialist spellcaster who requires an initial wizardry roll of 15 or higher. Rangers, who must roll triplets and then get an overall result of 15 in dexterity, and get to make all range attack rolls at a level 1 difficulty. And Leaders, who need to roll triples and get an overall result of 15 or higher in charisma, and get to make all persuasion rolls at a level 1 difficulty, so an actual charisma-based class. Then we have Paragon, which is basically the wizard warrior from previous editions and get all of the abilities of both wizards and warrior, except that they do not add their level to damage and may not create their own spells until 10th level. So even more overpowered than in 5th edition, but once again are restricted only to characters who roll natural 12s or higher in all their attributes. And as there are now 8 attributes, the chance of rolling 12 or higher in all of them is even lower than before. And finally, Citizen, who are deficient in both combat, getting only half their normal adds to damage, and magic, requiring an intelligence and dexterity save to cast any spell, and are restricted to characters who did not roll any triplets during attribute generation, and you would assume are only intended to be NPCs, but because this is 1985, we have to do the whole "of course, if a player really wanted the challenge, they could play as a citizen. Here are some tips for doing so" thing. Oh wait, no, it's 2005. Huh, weird. And looking at our stats, we do not qualify for Ranger, Leader, Paragon, or Citizen, and considering the fact that I just kind of glossed over Specialist Mage as if it was something I was planning on talking about later, let's go with Specialist Mage, which notably is the only specialist type that requires a score of 15 or higher, but does not require rolling triplets. And yeah, that very well could have been a typo, but when the same rule is in the base 7th edition and 7.5 released 3 years later, I have to assume it's intentional. And as a specialist mage, we have to choose a specialty, and the type section makes thematic suggestions like combat mage, healer, communicator, and spirit master, but the magic section makes it clear that you just specialize in one school of magic, the options being combat magic, which deals with all spells meant to be used directly against a foe. Cosmic magic, which deals with all spells that have a direct effect on the real universe. Conjuring magic, which deals with spells that summon, banish, or control beings, substances, and energies. And metabolic magic, which deals with all spells that directly affect characters' health or attributes. And as a fairy, it is probably most appropriate to specialize in metabolic magic and be a healer, or maybe cosmic and be some kind of mischievous trickster, which is why I am going with combat mage. And as a specialist mage, we do not gain all first level spells like a regular wizard does. Instead, we automatically gain all spells we are capable of casting from our specialty school as soon as we become capable of casting them. And spells come in various levels, with each level having a specified intelligence and dexterity requirement to cast that level of spell, which in this edition are conveniently the same. They were different in previous editions. So to cast level 1 spells, you need to have an intelligence and dexterity of 10. For level 2 spells, 12. For level 3 spells, 15. Level 4, 19. Level 5, 24. Level 6, 30, and so on and so on. So with 26 intelligence and 18 dexterity, we know all combat spells through 3rd level, and also get to cast those spells at half the normal wizardry cost. And then if our dexterity happened to go up to 19, we would then automatically learn all the level 4 combat spells. Then we get 1 talent, which is like a skill, basically. And we can just choose whatever we want, as long as we can tie it to a specific attribute. And let's go with aerobatics. And ironically, there is no space on the character sheet for talents, a thing added in 7th edition. And did I mention that this is 7.5, released 3 years after 7th edition? So I guess I'll just have to make a space for it. And aerobatics is reasonably tied to dexterity, so we roll a d6 and add that to our dexterity to get our talent value, which is 3 plus 18 is 21. Although the book recommends writing that as dex plus 3 because attributes are likely to change as a character progresses. And the roguery talent that I said I would explain later is the same, except that it is based on the highest of intelligence, luck, or charisma, and can be substituted for rolls using all of those attributes when doing something roguish. Also, a rogue's roguery, ranger's missile mastery, and leader's leadership abilities are all considered to be the 1 talent that starting characters get. Also, you may notice that I've been saying starting character and not level 1, and there is a reason for that. The entire concept of a character level has been radically changed here, so now instead of going up a level whenever you reach an arbitrary experience point threshold, your level is determined by the highest attribute of 4 specified for each type. So as a specialist with a wizardry score of 34, we start at level 3. Basically, your level is just always going to be equal to the tens place of the highest of those 4 attributes. And while I will get into leveling up later, for now I will just point out that you do gain 1 additional talent every time you gain a level. So we would gain a 2nd talent at 4th level, which would require us to raise our Constitution, Intelligence, Wizardry, or Charisma to 40, versus a character who starts at 1st or even 0th level, who would only need to raise one of their level attributes to 20 or 10. So high attributes will start you off at a higher level, which is good, but also you're going to lose potential talents for the levels you skipped. And finally, equipment. And we get 3d6 times 10, so 80 gold. And then run into a bit of an issue, in that we have a strength score of 2, which means we are unable to wield most weapons or wear most armor. Our options for weapon being restricted to about half the daggers, blowpipe, throwing stars, well, one of the 2 versions of throwing stars that appear in this book, and hand spikes. And let's just go with a Katar, which deals 2d6 plus 4 damage and weighs 22 weight units. And remember, we weigh 1.7 weight units. Yeah, equipment size and weight are a thing where, when you're dealing with humans, dwarves, and even hobbits, we don't really need to draw that much attention to it, but when your character is considerably smaller than a dagger made for a human, it makes you wonder if we should also be reducing the weight of equipment by 99.9%. But that would give us an effective weight possible of 200,000, as well as reasonably reducing weapon damage to a negligible amount. So overall, I am just going to assume that it is a don't think about it situation. Like, yeah, our weapon weighs considerably more than we do and deals 2d6 plus 4 damage despite being maybe an inch long, but also we are a fairy combat mage, so realism isn't exactly a top priority here. Then for armor, we have even fewer options, our strength of 2 being insufficient to wear even heavy cloth, which only provides 1 armor, so let's just get a set of Vam braces, which can be used at strength 2 and provide 2 points of armor, and have a weight of 10. And it is worth noting that a lot of the strength requirements for weapons and armor have been increased in 7th edition. For example, in 5th with a strength score of 2, we would have been able to wear quilted or even leather armor. In 7th, those requirements have been raised to 6 and 7. And now, for the weird part. As I said, I ignored the weight on weapons and armor because they provide a specific in-game benefit, but a pair of tiny knee boots don't really provide much in-game benefit, and definitely would not weigh 6 pounds. So if I were running this game and a player came to me with this specific conundrum, I would rule that any equipment that is only useful for the fairy character can be purchased at a reduced cost and weight. Like, a fairy's rations wouldn't amount to more than a few crumbs, a fairy torch wouldn't shine much more light than a match, and a fairy crowbar isn't going to be of much use for prying anything that isn't fairy-sized. So I would say that for such equipment that is only useful for the fairy character, 1/10 price and weight. Because honestly, the game stats just don't scale down that far, and at 0.17 pounds with a weight possible of 200, we are equivalent to a 170 pound human with a carrying capacity of 20,000 pounds. So 1/10 compensates for that enough, and is also just an easy calculation to do. It is very much this is the simple but perhaps not most accurate solution to this problem. And just in the interest of time, which yes, I realize I've already wasted a lot of, let's say an additional 20 gold and 30 weight of miscellaneous equipment. And this character is done. So, as with previous revisions, the mechanics haven't really undergone any major changes, just a handful of little ones. So let's say that Glittergore is adventuring on the 2nd level of the dungeon with Faerith, the elven magic user, Clover Thumplebump, the hob warrior, Grimbar, the dwarven warrior, and of course, as always, Steve, the human warrior. Exploration is no longer broken up into 10-minute turns. Things that used to occur every turn or last for a number of turns are still measured in 10-minute increments. It's just that the language of a turn being a specific 10-minute chunk of time has been removed. And as has been the trend with these videos, while exploring the corridor, it seems they have activated a trap card, and everyone needs to make a saving roll. And this is actually one of the biggest updates to the rules in this edition. In previous editions, you had a base value for the saving roll, from which you would subtract your luck score to determine a target with a minimum of 5 that you would roll against on 2d6. But now, things have been made considerably less stupid. The base values are the same, and let's just say that this is a level 1 trap, so 20. But now, instead of subtracting your luck from the base value to get a target value, you just roll versus that target and add your luck score to the result. So Glittergore and Clover pass, and everyone else fails. Or do they? Steve rolled 2 1s, and therefore activates the Darrow rule, which is like the Taro rule, except doubles add and roll over. So he gets to roll again, and that extra 9 pushes him over 20, so he succeeds. And notably, Darrow only applies on saving rolls. Faerith did not roll any doubles, but as a wizard with an intelligence of 24, she is level 2, and one of the main benefits of a character level is that you get to add your level to a failed save. And 18 plus 2 is 20, which is a pass. And for some reason, it is specifically stated that you only add the level if you initially fail the saving roll. Presumably there is some reason for that, but I cannot figure out what that reason could possibly be. And as for Grimbar, he rolled a 3, which is always a failure. As you can see here, having a total that would otherwise be an automatic success is not exactly a difficult thing to do, so there has to be some fumble value, and obviously it can't be 2 because of Darrow, so regardless of anything else, Grimbar still fails. However, everyone does still receive experience points, or adventure points as they are known in Tunnels and Trolls, equal to the total that they rolled times the level of the save. And saving rolls are also the de facto skill/attribute check in Tunnels and Trolls. Just substitute whatever the relevant attribute or talent is for luck, and there you go. So if you needed to break down a door, you would make a saving roll with strength. To do some acrobatic stunt, you would make a saving roll with dexterity. Or if you needed to do some fancy flying, you might have like an aerobatics talent you could use. And that is what the talents are. They are just a special value that you add to the saving roll when doing a specific task. And let's just say that Grimbar is affected by a poison that halves his combat adds until he can succeed on a level 1 Constitution saving roll, which shouldn't really be an issue unless, I don't know, they happen to run into a group of wandering monsters, like, right this second. Hey look, a group of wandering monsters. So it seems the party has run afoul of a couple trolls, a few goblins, and, let's do something different. How about a, blurring blarg? Combat is still resolved in rounds, so first we need to determine what everyone will do in this round. Glittergore is going to attack the closest troll with Take That You Fiend. Faerith is going to target the closest goblin with the same. Clover is going to attack the second goblin with her sling staff, except that she can't because the strength requirement on a sling staff was increased from 5 to 8. So even though it looks like she is still wielding a sling staff, it's actually just a common sling. And Grimbar and Steve are going to engage the front line in melee. So first up is Magic, and let's just start with Faerith. Magic now requires an intelligence saving roll of a level equal to the spell's level. So roll 2d6 plus 24 is 32 versus 20, and a success. And presumably also earns us 8 adventure points. And Take That You Fiend costs 6 wizardry to cast, but since she is using a magic staff, she gets to reduce that by her level, so -2, and also the difference between character level and level of spell, so another -1 for an overall cost of 3. And then characters also get 1 additional adventure point for each point of wizardry spent for casting spells, so another 3. And Take That You Fiend deals damage equal to your intelligence score, but let's just hold on to that for now. And next up, Glittergore. However, she is actually going to cast Take That You Fiend at level 2, which is a thing you've been able to do the whole time, I've just never bothered explaining it before. So that means she needs to make the save versus a target of 25, which, with an intelligence of 26, is not exactly difficult to do. But since this is a level 2 save, it also awards adventure points equal to the roll times 2. And increasing the level of a spell also increased the cost by the base amount times however many levels it's been raised. So Take That You Fiend as a level 1 spell costs 6 points to cast, and as a level 2 spell, 12. But as a combat mage, Glittergore gets to reduce the cost of casting combat spells by half, so 6 wizardry. And then for every increase in level, the spell's damage doubles, so 52 damage. And yes, I said doubles at each level, so casting the spell at level 3 would cost 18 points, reduced to 9, but also deal 104 damage. So, honestly, this is a really overpowered spell, and I don't know why it's the default, because it outclasses every other damaging spell in the entire game. Just for example, let's compare Take That You Fiend to another level 1 spell, Call Flame, which deals 1d6 damage versus Take That You Fiend's minimum of 10, and adds 1 additional d6 per level increase versus an exponential modifier, and has a range of touch versus line of sight up to 100 feet, and costs 1 more wizardry to cast. But, that's another low-level spell, and it's from a different school. Surely the higher-level combat spells will be better. I mean, I did say this was better than every other damaging spell. So, let's look at the highest-level damaging spell in the book. The 10th level, Hellbomb Burst, which costs 100 wizardry to cast, and deals damage equal to 10 times the caster's combined intelligence and dexterity. And since you need at least 64 intelligence and dexterity to learn a level 10 spell, that is a minimum of 1280 damage, and also has the same 100-foot range and doubling effect of Take That You Fiend. However, if we wanted to cast Take That You Fiend at level 10, it would only cost 60 wizardry, and deal damage equal to the caster's intelligence times 512, which, assuming you still need to have the required intelligence and dexterity to cast a lower level spell at a higher level, as you would need for just casting the higher level spell, is a minimum of 32,768 damage. And I'm sure you're thinking that I'm clearly just some idiot who doesn't realize that when they say double, obviously they meant doubles at level 2, triples at level 3, and so on, like it did in 4th and 5th edition. Because there's no way this level 1 spell is actually that obscenely powerful. And no, I assure you that this is the intended and explicitly specified way that Take That You Fiend levels up in the mystical 7th edition. Once again though, we just have to hold on to that value for right now and move on to missile attacks. So, just like in 5th edition, Clover needs to make a dexterity saving roll to hit, but now it is simply based on the distance instead of distance multiplied by size. And at 2 to 30 feet, this is a level 2 saving roll, so a target of 25. And hits. And in the previous edition, it was specified that you did not get experience points for that roll, but here, making a missile attack is the example that is used when explaining that you get adventure points for making saving rolls, so presumably that means we get adventure points for making that saving roll. And that is why I decided to award adventure points for spellcasting rolls too. At no point does it specify an exception, so I must assume that when they say, whenever a character attempts a saving roll, it means whenever a character attempts a saving roll. So a sling deals 2 dice damage, plus Clover's combat adds of 15. Unfortunately though, the specification that dexterity adds double to missile attacks has been removed. But also, as a warrior with dexterity 27, Clover is level 2, so another plus 2 for 24 damage overall. And now on to melee. Grimbar attacks with his Great Axe, which deals 5d6 plus 3, plus half his personal adds of 18, and with a strength of 32 is a level 3 warrior, so plus 3 for 29 overall. And Steve attacks with his Gladius for 3d6 plus 2 and no personal adds, but with a strength of 13 is level 1, so plus 1 for 18 overall. Then we add the damage from all of the attacks for 147 damage total. Then it is the monster's turn. Monsters in Tunnels and Trolls are defined by a single monster rating which functions as both hit points and a measure of combat ability. And rather than a set table, monsters now roll a dice equal to 1/10 their monster rating plus 1, which is the same number as in 5th edition, they just give you a formula instead of a table. So a troll with a monster rating of 50 rolls 6 dice, plus half their monster rating, rounded up, so plus 25. Then we roll for all of the other monsters, and a total of 201. And the monster's damage total is higher, meaning that they win this round, so we subtract the character total from the monster total, and get 54 damage, which is divided between the characters. And now the thing I mentioned earlier about fairies being more viable now. In previous editions, that damage would be divided evenly between the characters, which would be enough to kill Glittergore twice over. But now, damage is arranged any way the losing side wants among its characters. And also you now need to get to -10 Constitution to die instead of 0, so fairies are still fragile, but can reasonably last more than a single round in combat now. And if we wanted to metagame here, the quickest thing to do would be just add the armor value of all the characters together for a total of 54, meaning that through clever arrangement of damage, we could negate up to 54 damage total. And that is actually what we're going to do because it is quick and convenient to do so. So, no damage on either side, except for all the damage that I haven't dealt with yet. So remember how we had to roll for spells and missile attacks? Well, that is because we had to roll for a mischance then, because if successful, those attacks always go through regardless of which side wins. So Glittergore's Take That You Fiend is applied to the first troll, who is no more. The first goblin takes 24 damage from Faerith's Take That You Fiend, and the second 24 damage from Clover's Sling. And now, I need to talk about special damage. Every 6 that is rolled counts for 6 damage, but also 1 point of spite damage, damage that gets through in spite of everything. So regardless of which side wins, spite damage always applies and ignores armor. So the characters rolled 2 dice of spite damage, and since one of those was from a missile attack, I am going to say that it has to be applied to the target of that attack, and the other I will just give to the second troll. And then the monsters rolled 5 sixes. However, not every 6 is going to be spite damage. If we pull up the 7th edition monster books, the spite damage system has also been used to power a special damage system for monsters. So for example, if a Blurring Blerg rolls 2 sixes, it slimes a foe, replicating the effects of the Glue You spell. And let's just say that the Blob's slime affects Steve since he's closest, and can now only act every other turn for 5 turns. Then 3 spike damage remains, and let's give all those to Grimbar because he can take it, which is then deducted from his constitution. And just in general, I think this is one of the coolest additions to the game. Armor in Tunnels and Trolls can be a little overpowered, as in many games, and battles can easily reach a stalemate, like in this very round where 147 versus 201 boiled down to 0 damage. You know, excluding spells and missile attacks, which you are not always going to have. And keep in mind, the monsters can have armor too. Like, let's say that Steve was fighting his evil twin Yvette's. He has 24 armor and 3d6 plus 3 damage, so excluding the rare lucky triple roll, it would be impossible for either to actually deal any damage, which makes the addition of a form of chip damage very helpful in preventing combats from going nowhere. Especially given the focus on solo play, where the single armored warrior versus single armored warrior scenario is much more common than the big group versus big group with swingy triple-digit results that we've got going here. Also, the special damage activating abilities is just a really convenient way to give monsters special abilities that go off at a predictable frequency, but you do not have exact control over. But now to finish up the round, Grimbar makes his constitution save and succeeds. And that is it for round 1, so on to round 2. And sensing the threat of further goo-related mishaps, Glittergore targets the Blurg with another level 2 TTYF, as the kids call it. And Faerith targets the remaining troll with a level 2 Hold That pose, because everyone just casting Take That You Fiend over and over and over is kinda boring. Especially for a combat example. Then Clover targets the second goblin again. In 5th edition, it was specified that missile attacks could only be made in the first round of combat, but here it is not, and is only specified that you can only make 1 missile attack per combat turn, as well as having their damage cut quite a bit, so I assume the intention is that you can use them after the first round. And Grimbar continues to hold the monsters back, while Steve is gooed out. So Glittergore and Faerith make their intelligence saving rolls and pass, because they both can only fail on a 3, and Glittergore's spell once again does 52 damage, to be applied later, and Faerith's Hold That pose leaves the troll helpless for 2 turns, costing them each 6 wizardry. Then Clover rolls and also hits for 8 plus 15 plus 2 is 25 damage, and Grimbar rolls for 17 plus 3 plus 18 plus 3 is 41 damage. However, Taro always applies in TNT, and that looks like 3 2s to me, so another roll and 52. And Steve is a bit busy being slimy at the moment, so 129 total. And then the monsters roll, excluding the pose-holding troll, and a change in 7th edition, a monster's attack dice do not go down with their monster rating, only their adds. So at a full monster rating of 30, a goblin rolls 4 dice plus 15. But when reduced to a monster rating of 6, they still roll 4 dice plus 3. Versus previous editions where the dice also went down with the monster rating. So the monsters roll for a total of 92, with 1 spite damage on the character side and 3 for the monsters. And 129 minus 92 is 37 damage to split between the monsters, or rather it would if this were all melee damage. If your side wins, magic and missile damage is deducted from the damage total. So the Blaring Blarg goes splat, the second goblin goes splat, and there is no damage left over to divide between the remaining monsters. And then just because they were both unable to attack this round, it only makes sense to apply the spite damage to Steve and the remaining troll. And then on to Round 3, in which Glittergore is going to cast Little Feet on Grimbar, Faerith will cast Vorpal Blade on Grimbar's axe, Clover will attack the wounded goblin, and Grimbar and Steve will engage the remaining goblins. So the casters make their spell checks, and Glittergore casts Little Feet for 4 wizardry, which doubles the target's speed for 5 turns, and Faerith casts Vorpal Blade, which doubles the weapon's damage for 1 turn for the low cost of 5 minus 3 is 2 wizardry. Then Clover rolls and hits for 20 damage, and let's just go with Steve next, who rolls 8 plus 2 plus 1 is 11 damage, and Grimbar, who rolls 17 plus 3 is 20, doubled by the Vorpal Blade spell to 40, plus personal adds of 18 and level of 3 for 61 damage total, and then rolls again because of the Little Feet spell for 19 plus 3 is 22, doubled to 44, plus 18 plus 3 is 65, plus 61 is 126, plus Clover's 20 and Steve's 11 for 157 and 3 spite. Then the monsters roll again, excluding the troll who is still holding that pose, for 47 total, also with 3 spite damage. And 157 minus 47 is 110. So first we will apply the 20 damage from Clover's attack, eliminating the wounded goblin and leaving us with 90 damage to split between the 2 remaining monsters. And now for the downside to damage being arranged any way the losing side wants among its characters. In previous editions, this damage would be split 45 and 45 between the goblin and troll. Those 15 points of damage above the goblin's monster rating would just be lost, with the troll barely making it into the next round with 3 monster rating remaining. But given the ability to divide damage as desired, no damage is going to be lost. You can't really say that the goblin takes all 90 and the troll is untouched. So they are both very dead. And yes, that wouldn't really have made much of a difference here, but in situations where you have more wounded units, the damage loss from splitting could be significantly larger. And as the whirling dervish of death for this round, it only makes sense for Grimbar to take the 3 spite damage. And now that the monsters are no more, Faerith decides to cast Poor Baby on Steve to heal some of his damage, but gets a bad feeling about doing so. Magic has been given an additional restriction now. You cannot cast spells on a target that has a higher current wizardry score. And after casting all those spells, Steve's wizardry currently exceeds Faerith's, meaning that even voluntarily, she cannot affect him with any spell. And as suggested, if you do try to cast a spell on such a target, you will just get a bad feeling and are allowed to abort the spell without wasting your wizardry. So, the wizardry attribute actually does have a function for non-casters. A double-edged function, but a function nonetheless. So the monsters have been defeated, and the characters gain a number of adventure points equal to their total monster rating. So 50 plus 50 plus 30 plus 30 plus 30 plus 32 is 222 divided between the characters. Yes, 1st through 4th edition didn't really specify. 5th edition said divide it or don't, whatever, you do you. But 7th edition actually specifically says to divide the total between the characters. So 44.4 adventure points each, and let's just say 45 because I don't really care to squabble over 0.6 points. And then head back up to the surface where we also receive 100 AP for each level of dungeon or difficulty that is overcome. And since we survived the 2nd level of the dungeon, that is 200 for a total of 308 adventure points for that little adventure. And you might be wondering how leveling works now that level is based on your attributes. Well, you now get to spend your adventure points directly on increasing your attributes at a cost equal to the attribute's current value times 10. So if we wanted to increase our dexterity to 19 so that we could access all the 4th level combat spells, we could do so at the cost of 180 adventure points. However, I'm not going to do that because those 180 points would be much better spent on upping our constitution to 7, meaning that we can now definitely take a single d6 damage, because even though we can avoid the main combat damage with math now, we cannot do the same for traps and other hazards. And also, remember how we got to hit specific targets with spells and missile attacks? Well, the monsters can do that too, because remember the first rule of ttrpg combat. If it's fair when the players do it, it's fair when the monsters do it too. And we still have 128 points left, so honestly it's probably best to up Constitution as much as possible, so one more in that for 70 points, and 58 left, and might as well spend 50 to up our Strength to 4 and get a few more options for weapons and armor, as well as increasing our combat adds by 2. And that is all the points that can be spent. And overall, I will say this is probably the best update in 7th edition. Well, 7.5. In the 30th Anniversary Edition, it was a number of points equal to the current attribute times 100, which, like many things in the long and sordid history of Tunnels and Trolls, was somehow seen as a good idea at the time. And also worth mentioning, in base 7th edition, talents did not scale with their associated attribute, or rather they scaled at a different accelerated pace. So instead of writing out your talent as dexterity plus 3, you would just calculate it to 21, and then every time you raise the governing attribute, the talent's value increases by your level. So if this was base 7th edition and we spent 1800 adventure points to increase dexterity to 19, our aerobatics talent would also increase to 24. So talents used to get fairly notable increases, but losing that in exchange for lowering the cost to increase attributes by 90% is more than a fair trade. Because this is a game where you can easily end up with some bad attributes, especially now that you have 8 of them. And compared to the old system where you only got to add the new level to one attribute, or half that level, or double that level for luck for some reason, this system makes it really easy to build up those low scores, assuming you survive your first adventure. Instead of having to choose between putting 1 point in dexterity or 2 in constitution, we get to choose 1 point in dexterity or 4 points in constitution, with enough left over for 1 more con and 2 strength. And that was a Tunnels and Trolls 7th edition character. Well, 7.5. A revision 25 years in the making that doesn't really feel like it. Like, don't get me wrong, this is the most significant revision of Tunnels and Trolls to date, but also just feels like a kinda lazy hack of 5th edition, with a bunch of stuff left out. This is also by a wide margin the most usable Tunnels and Trolls book, although admittedly that is a fairly low bar. Overall, it feels like an actual cohesive set of rules, versus previous editions which more so felt like a haphazardly thrown together collection of notes. It does still suffer from issues like a section referring you to a section that refers you to a third section instead of just giving you all the information in one place, but overall it is better than the previous format where basic things like character creation rules were broken up between 2 or 3 different sections throughout the book. Like, seriously, every time I had to look up something in a previous edition for this video, it was just such a chore to find even simple pieces of information. However, the new, simplified, modernized, But not D20, right, fellas? Rules do have a specific issue for a specific audience, an audience that I, unfortunately, happen to be a member of. Because of the fairly minimal revisions throughout the entire game's history, it's still basically the same rules as first edition, so if you are familiar with the previous editions, it is easy to accidentally assume that rules from those editions still apply, even though they have been removed, or just kinda left out. And just in general, it feels like there was a lot of information in Ken St. Andre's head that just failed to make its way onto the page, and he failed to notice. Like, not only is it no longer specified that fairies can only fly while carrying up to half their weight possible, it's not even specified that they can fly. Like, fairies are only even mentioned 3 times in the 7th edition book, and 5 in 7.5, which makes the 7.5 revision even more perplexing because, while it did include a few rules updates, it mostly just added filler, instead of, adding any of the content that was clearly left out. But overall, if you are not familiar with any other edition of the game, this is probably going to be your best introduction. It is, by a wide margin, the most user-friendly version of Tunnels and Trolls. Although I know some people consider that to be a bad thing. As long as you just accept that whatever is in the book is the full extent of the rules, aren't afraid to make a few assumptions, and ignore anything that seems to be referencing rules that don't exist. So that is it for Tunnels and Trolls 7th edition, and make sure to come back next time when I will be looking at Tunnels and Trolls 7th edition. How's that for a teaser? And thank you for watching. If you enjoy the wacky things I say and do, you can follow me on Blue Sky and/or Tumblr. You can also join me live on Twitch, where sometimes things get a little weird. And extra special thanks to my Fightin' Flail Snails, Broken Unicorn, D-Stex, Hasterfan, Nikolai Snowtail, Puggo, Randy Mulholland, Renee D, Stephen Kramer, Tila Glar, Toshiro Kuro, and Tyro the Fox. If you want to be cool like them, check out my Patreon or YouTube channel memberships, 2 different things that provide similar but distinct benefits. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos that have mysteriously manifested from the ethers, which I am sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.